Greetings and welcome back. We now turn to the page that is titled Nation States and Nation States. And at first glance, you may think, why this title? Because when we think about a nation and a state, most people think the nation is the United States, the state is California. But in the world of comparative politics, nations and states have a different meaning than what we typically call a nation and a state. If you're following along in your notes, a nation is the cultural element of a country where people are tied to one another, usually psychologically, in some way. If you look at the Latin root word, it means birth, which originally meant that nation referred to racial ties between people. But in the more recent era, in the last, I would say, half century, this definition has been broadened to essentially mean a common identity. And generally, this common identity is what calls for statehood. So, for example, you had a group of people that for years were Germanic. They were split into numerous little city states at one time, well over 1,000. And they spoke a similar language, although dialects, accents were different. But there was not a unified German state until the creation of modern Germany after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. So usually you have a group of people who feel this common tie, and then a modern state comes out of it. So the Chinese created China, the Japanese created Japan, the French created France, uh, Italians created Italy. Italy is another modern state. Before there was a modern Italy in the mid 19th century, for several centuries, what today is Italy were some city states, and about five of them were dominant, and they were about co equal in power. So, nation, we're talking about a group of people with a common identity, and in many cases, its race or its ethnicity. You should star. Roskin mentions quite a bit that what we consider modern nationalism is often associated with the French Revolution and with Napoleon. And I may ask you on the exam, with what modern event do we associate modern nationalism? Certainly be the French Revolution and or Napoleon. Napoleon really did unleash modern nationalism throughout Europe in the 19th century, and I mentioned in the notes the formation of new countries, including Greece, Italy. I didn't type in Belgium, but that would be another country. And probably most importantly for world history, Germany, because certainly with the creation of unified Germany in the latter 19th century, it changes the distribution of power in the European nation state centered system, which had existed for well over 200 years when Germany was formed. So nationalists make the assumption that it is the nation, it is the group of people, and not the state that should be the defining characteristic of a system. So when we talk about nationalism, we're talking about looking after the interests, whatever that happens to be, of a group of people. Now, sometimes nationalism can be pretty nasty because it places an emphasis on the distinctiveness of one's nation. It advocates the creation of a separate nation state. One of the problems of doing this is, of course, usually when a group of people places an emphasis on the distinctiveness of their own nation, that creates a we versus they kind of mentality. And often nationalists assumed some form of superiority with their nation and an inferiority with someone else. So if we look at the German nationalists that followed Hitler, for example, Hitler was very explicit about this and referred to certain people as culture creators, culture bearers, and culture destroyers. And of course, that became Hitler's rationale for unfortunately engaging in genocide against groups of people, most famously the Jews, but also disabled people, gypsies, and a variety of others. I give a brief definition of ethnicity, uh, which is typically a group of individuals with a distinct culture in common, and race is some common biological characteristics that a group may share. But the most important element about nation is that you should understand that it is this common group of people. It's psychological, it's physical. That modern nationalism is associated with the French Revolution and Napoleon. And so when I talk about a group of people as a nation, and there are a lot of nations that don't have states, not that are fully defined. You can think about, again, going back to the examples I gave you earlier, the Chechens are a nation, but they live under Russian rule and in the country of Russia. Or you can think about the Palestinians who for years have wanted a fully sovereign state. For many, many centuries, the Jews were a nation that did not have a state until the creation of Israel after World War II. There are many more nations in the world than there are states, and there are many, many nations that do not have their own independent state. The state is a political entity with territory, people, government, boundaries, and sovereignty. I talked a bit about sovereignty in the definitions earlier. Roskin defines sovereignty in chapter 1 with it's kind of a simplistic notion, but it's easy to understand as boss on your own turf. I wouldn't disagree with that. What I told you earlier, remember, is that I think that a state needs both internal and external sovereignty. And I went into a lot of detail on that earlier, so I will not do it now. But just a reminder that internal sovereignty is where you have control over your citizens and your own territory. And external sovereignty is where you have autonomy, you have independence from outside intervention. And you may remember me using the example of Iran, who the Shah of Iran, for example, who ruled for 25 years in Iran, had significant internal sovereignty, but was really beholden to the United States, and without the support of the United States, would find it difficult to hold on to power. So there is a situation where Iran from the mid 1950s until the late 1970s had one component of sovereignty, but did not have the other. Roskin, in chapter 1, your textbook author, claims that France became the first modern state during the 30 Years' War. I will talk a bit more about this later on. The 30 Years' War is really interesting because it begins as kind of a traditional medieval religious war fought between Catholic and Protestant princes. It was kind of the last of the wars over the Reformation. By the end of the war, it becomes a modern war because France, which is a Catholic country, turns on its Catholic ally, Austria, fearing that if the Catholics were to win this war, that Austria would become the dominant country on the continent. And so France ends up switching sides late in the war. and ends up, in essence, aiding the Protestants in this particular case. The French, for the first time, thought that it was in their national interest, and we hear that term all the time in this particular case, for the lands to the east of them to be divided between Catholic and Protestant rule. France, by the end of the 30 Years' War, had the most able military in the world. They had a very able and efficient bureaucracy. And again, they had cultivated this notion of a national interest. And of course, Roskin doesn't go into that much detail, but he does say in chapter 1 that the old feudal order was replaced by the modern nation state era at the end of the 30 Years' War. And this is a war, and I don't want to go into too much detail now because when we get to France and to Germany, I will discuss this war in more length. But this war, the 30 Years' War, I believe, is the most important war that perhaps you're not very aware of. The war was devastating. During that 30-year period from 1618 to 1648, the population of Europe declined by about 1/3. Some big cities, Berlin's population, for example, plummeted by about 50%. If you think about how horrific our pandemic has been, and it has been, this COVID crisis has resulted in over 400,000 deaths. But to put the 30 Years' War into a context that will really bring home my point, if the United States were involved in a war in which we would lose 1/3 of our population, we would have 110 million people die. And that's what happened during the 30 Years' War. The population declined by 1/3. Now, most of those people did not die because of casualties on the battlefield. Most of these people died from disease and plague and starvation and a variety of other things. So this war was really truly catastrophic to the people who lived at that time. And this war is very, very important for us in the world of comparative politics, because at the end of this war, the modern nation state system that still exists today became the dominant means of political organization. It is the strong nation states that became the dominant states, first in Europe, and then ultimately throughout the world, as these dominant European powers projected their power through colonialism and empire, with Britain having the largest of these empires in the world, and the French having the second largest of these empires. And there were other countries that also obviously engaged in colonialism, the Spanish, the Portuguese, later on the Dutch, and some others. When we come back in the next mini lecture, no, I guess I can finish it in this one. I've got a minute left before I get to nation states. I'll just read from this because I won't have time to make many comments. Roskin points out, to be stable, a state must have legitimacy. I defined this earlier. Legitimacy is a perception that one's rule is rightful. It doesn't mean that they think that one's rule is good. When we use the term government in this course, we mean the leadership that is in power at a particular moment in time. For example, in Britain, the government is named after the prime minister. So today in Britain, when they talk about the government, they talk about the Johnson government. In the United States, we also do this. We tend to name the Supreme Court after the Chief Justice at the time. So today, we speak of the Roberts Court. after the Chief Justice. In the next mini lecture, I'll get into the concept of nation states.